webinar for Scaling Up of the year. As you all are aware, Scaling Up is it's called to action number 22, focused on large landscape conservation. This page right here, if you're looking at your computer, is our home page within the Park Service for Scaling Up. There's a lot of great info there. Right here is our external Park Service website on the Practitioners Network for Large Landscape Conservation. And with that, I'll pass it over to John. But beforehand, again, for those of you on the phone, please put your phones on mute, but not on hold, because if you put it on hold, we might get some beeping. So put your phones on mute. And John, you want to take it away?
Oh, sure, thanks. Again, this is John Putnam with International. Trying to talk over someone's crumbling paper there. But anyway, thank you all for joining us today. Again, this is part of the Scaling Up series of webinars. And with my position here at International Affairs, I've been advocating for our group to scale up even further from sort of the immediate landscapes with which we're more familiar to thinking in terms of how parks are connected sort of at the hemispheric or even global level through migratory birds and other wildlife. And over the years, I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Peter Mera of the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center here in Washington. Pete, among other things, recently been involved with a project to help us track wood thrushes at St. Croix National Scenic River, and I heard the superintendent is on the line, so maybe at the end of our discussion today we can talk a little about that particular project. But I know we have a short amount of time, and I want to make sure Pete has his opportunity to give the presentation. So with that, Pete Mera, please take it away.
Great, thanks John, and thanks Brian for setting this up. So as John said, I'm head of the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. I'm part of the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute here in Washington, D.C.
Some of our,
some people aren't on mute yet.
Folks on the phone, please remember to put your phone on mute. Thank you.
You want it like a little brochure or like a one-pager?
Yeah, one-pager would be fine. It doesn't have to be comprehensive. I think just to give them an idea.
I'm going to hold off because I don't want to talk over them.
Maybe one or two sentence description of what the
hello, folks.
Okay. Then if you have something.
Well, I'll try to go. Can folks hear me? I guess they're all on mute. So.
We can hear you.
Okay.
So the guy from Bangladesh.
Yeah.
If this continues, I'd suggest people just call.
Oh, Agnes.
Yeah.
Start over.
So I'll just go ahead and jump in here. Cycles are pervasive throughout all physical and biological systems.
Mandela Fellows last summer.
Yeah.
Physical cycles as significant as the rotation, as you can see here, of a tilted
Yeah,
Earth
they were.
around
They
the
were working
sun,
on turtles. I don't know.
and train enormous numbers of living things in our planet into daily and annual. I'm sorry.
I'm
This is
sorry.
like
Oh, there was a guy in
Can we all dial in again and drop this person
there
off?
was a guy in Santa Monica Mountains, a French guy that
Do it
did
because they're clearly clueless.
masters.
Yeah, they're
Okay.
But that's a great idea.
Dial in
Bye.
again.
I'm like,
And we'll dial back in.
Postage spreading invasive invasive
That's
species.
very interesting. Yeah, I think that's great.
Okay.
Anything like that.
Okay.
Welcome back. Yeah, thank you. It was good. We're good dogs now.
Get a little.
No, it was good.
When they come back,
Right.
presentation with the ambassador.
Okay.
folks.
Yeah, that sounds.
Finding opportunities
Right.
to sort of highlight.
Can
Right.
you use your
Yeah, that
phone?
sounds good. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Can, but we
Brian, you
can
there?
get rid of those folks.
We'll give it a minute for everybody to pop in.
Thank you for your patience.
Oh, no worries. These webinars save us, enormous amounts of money and minimize environmental impacts, but there are other complications that no one would have been able to predict.
Indeed, indeed.
I've always wanted to enter a laugh track into mine because I like the audience feedback, and I occasionally crack jokes that I think are funny. So I've wanted to put in a Brady Bunch laugh track to throw in there, but I haven't done it yet. What do you? Let's see. You're still popping in.
Let's jump back on this. Yeah. When we have lunch, I can hear more about it. We don't have a date, but I'll send some options. Yeah, it's funny this webinar. There was one person who wouldn't put their phone on mute, shut up. So they said we're gonna actually shut down the webinar.
The person just stayed on the phone and never muted his phone. We're just still with them.
Can you mute all the
They must have called in and then just put the phone on speaker. So anyway, I have to get called back in.
So can everyone see the GAT screen on the far right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna type in a different conference bridge number, and I want everyone to dial into that.
Is it quieted down?
Yes.
Oh, is everyone?
Maybe they got it.
It's
Okay.
quiet down now.
I don't.
Let's try.
All
I
right.
think there's a gentleman typing who was just talking about the need to call back in. That person needs to mute his phone.
Yeah. So maybe that was.
Let's go.
Whoever it was.
Let's go for it.
All right. Do we want to stick then with this?
Yeah, let's go. Let's do it.
Go
This
for
is
it.
Pete.
Go for it, Pete.
Great. So my point in showing you this is that we are driven by cycles. They are pervasive in everything we are and everything we do. And there's many different types of biological cycles. For example, there's the simple 24-hour rotation of this Earth that exposes us all, plants and animals, to these light and dark cycles. And consequently, our behavior, our physiology, as well as the organisms around us respond to these daily rhythms. And they're critical for controlling so many of these fundamental biological phenomena. It's when you start to think about it, you really start to get an understanding of how important it is. Similarly, this rotation of this tilted Earth around the sun drives these seasonal changes that we're all so familiar with, both in terms of how seasons change from spring to summer to fall, and then finally into winter, which we're entering now, of course. And in the tropics, a similar pattern is seen, of course, with precipitation. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today is that, while I think we've recognized the importance of cycles in many ways, there are many ways that we also have not done so. We've done so in biochemistry and physiology and some other areas, but when we've thought about ecology, we've thought about evolution, and more importantly, when we've thought about conservation and how we can more effectively conserve species, we have not thought about these cycles. In other words, what I'm arguing is that we haven't been studying animals, or doing our conservation in the context of a full annual cycle, or ultimately a full life cycle. So I did a review of the literature for about a 10-year period. I've actually expanded this to 15 years, and we just published this past year. I'm happy to share that paper with you all if you like. It came out in Biology Letters. But I looked at the research that was done on amphibians and actually reptiles as well. They're not on here, birds and mammals. And I looked at when in the annual cycle that research is done. And what I found was that most of this research has been totally biased towards the breeding season. If you look at amphibians, 96% of the research that has been done has been focused on the breeding season. For birds, this is songbirds, 75% of the research has been focused during the breeding season. And for mammals, 67% has been focused on breeding. Reptiles is equally biased. Now, in general, I would say we have a breeding focus, and we have that for a variety of reasons. One of which is that it's logistically challenging to do work throughout the annual cycle. It's a timing thing. Most of the research that happens is actually done by students, or the conservation is many times done by students, or how we do the conservation. It's also expensive to do throughout the year. So going back to the student thing, most students do their work during the summer, and that's typically the breeding season. And most of those people are in temperate areas. But it's also expensive to study animals throughout the year as opposed to a short, small period. But there's also this false impression that everything that happens outside the breeding area is unimportant. And that's been talked about by some pretty impressive ecologists and biologists over the years, without good reason. And so they've pushed this without a real understanding of this full idea. But the other reason I think we haven't really taken a full annual cycle approach for both resident and migratory birds is that we basically haven't been able to track individuals or populations well throughout the annual cycle. So as a result, we have a poor understanding of the phenomenon we call migratory connectivity. And that is simply the geographic linking of individuals or populations between different stages of the annual cycle. If you look at figure A here, it simply means that these birds, or whatever these happen to be that are breeding here, where do they go? Do they go straight down here, straight down to their wintering grounds in Central America? Or if you look at B, do they crisscross? Or do you have a single population, as is illustrated in C, that spreads out throughout the entire wintering range? We don't know the basic patterns of migratory connectivity for most species, not just birds, but dragonflies, most fish, most organisms that move throughout the year. We just don't have a good understanding of this phenomenon. And it's critical. Knowing migratory connectivity is essential for understanding fundamental biology, and I could talk about this for days, as well as understanding conservation. It's critical for knowing simply where and why animals die. And that is of such critical importance to understanding population dynamics. That's what drives population dynamics, is why animals die and where they die, and then how they reproduce, and what drives how they reproduce. This is it's just critical to these fundamental processes that are not only of fundamental biological importance, they're critical for us to be able to do effective conservation. It's also important for just being able to know population vulnerability. If you have a particular species that's declining rapidly, knowing where they are throughout the year is going to enable you to protect that species or that population throughout the year. If you don't know where they go, you can't protect them. It's that simple. It's essential for basic animal management. That's what I'm trying to basically say here. So if you're in charge of a particular plot of land, whether you're DOD or your National Park Service, if your animals are only there for 2 months or 3 months of the year and then they're gone the rest of the year, and you don't know where they are, you don't know why their population sizes are changing. It may not be anything to do with what you're doing on the ground there. It may have all to do with what's happening to them during migration or while they're on their wintering grounds, whether that be Venezuela, Cuba, Belize, or Mexico. Who knows where it is? Understanding migratory connectivity is critical for understanding the spread of infectious diseases like avian influenza, West Nile virus, also ticks. We just had a paper come out that showed that neotropical migrants in spring carry a variety of neotropical ticks. And in those ticks, they carry a variety of parasites that are known to cause disease in humans. It's critical for understanding the impacts of climate change. In fact, I would say most of our understanding of climate change is fraught with problems because we haven't taken a full annual cycle understanding or approach to understanding the exposure that animals are or the climate exposure that animals are subject to throughout the year. We've always focused on how temperature might be changing on breeding areas where they are for such a short period and ignored the fact that these animals are in the tropics where precipitation might be changing rapidly, influencing their condition and ability to even make it back to the breeding areas. All these things are essential for understanding the dynamics or the effects of a particular stressor. It's ultimately important, as I've already said, for understanding or making strategic conservation initiatives. If you've got a population of species declining, the only way you're really going to do effective management of that species is to really understand the threats that they face throughout the year. Otherwise, you're just completely missing the boat. And we need the information now. We're dealing with some real serious problems with declines in many of our migratory birds. And for the most part, we can't address these declines because we just don't have this fundamental information on migratory connectivity, where specific populations go throughout the year. Yes, we know the general ranges of species, but we also know that for the most part, that's not sufficient. That level of detail doesn't get us anywhere. It's too large of an area, and we can't do the sort of strategic conservation initiatives to be able to address things at that scale. It's just impossible. So what I'm basically saying here is that the periods of the annual cycle are inextricably linked. This is an American redstart. This is a typical life cycle for a species like a migratory bird, but you could build one of these life cycle diagrams for any species, whether it's resident or migrant, and the same point would be true. You can see here this red represents the breeding time, breeding period. These redstarts arrive back in breeding areas anytime between May and June, depending upon where they go. Males and females pair up, and they raise one brood of young. Then they go through a molt, complete molt, and they go through a very quick migration, and then they head down to the tropics. And it's there where they spend the majority of the annual cycle. And what a lot of my research has shown, and I'm not going to go into the details of this today, but we've shown this in redstarts and a variety of other species, is that what happens to them here in the tropics, whether it's a wet or a dry winter, or they get into a really good habitat or a really bad habitat, that actually determines the number of young that they fledge back up on breeding areas up here in the US or Canada. So it's not a matter of how much habitat we save up here. It's really a matter of how much habitat or what happens with climate down in the tropics. So ultimately, these periods of the annual cycle are inextricably linked. And when you start to think about it, it makes sense. Natural selection acts on these individuals throughout the year. Why would we expect just to sort of pull out the breeding period and explain all the important variation that might be occurring there as an important driver of everything that has to do with the biology of these species? It doesn't make sense. So these seasonal interactions are simply circumstances within one period or season of the annual cycle that influence events or traits in the subsequent period. I'm not going to go into these details, but that's sort of another reason why understanding migratory connectivity is key, so we can understand how and why their variation in their ecology or their evolutionary traits occur. It's fundamentally important. So these seasonal interactions drive fundamental ecological and evolutionary processes, things like reproductive success, the abundance and survival of birds, and even things like breeding season range limits. We've demonstrated this in over 50 to 75 different peer-reviewed papers, and now lots of other people are demonstrating this for species like shorebirds and hawks, and even in mammals and reptiles and things like sea turtles. The literature is now becoming filled with more and more studies of carryover effects and seasonal interactions. And it basically says what I've just said, is that it's really essential if you want to interpret the events during any one period, whether it's during the breeding period when birds are back on a national park, you really need to understand where those birds came from and what they were exposed to. What were the threats that they saw? What habitats were those birds in? And that means interpreting those things in the context of the full annual cycle, or ultimately in the context of the full life cycle. And it's essential for conservation. We can't do conservation without it. In 2014, we put together a large group of scientists, ornithologists. We did something that really can't be done with many other groups of animals, and that is the state of the bird, sort of an assessment of the health of our nation's birds. And I'll just give you a quick report card of what we found for some species in some habitats. And the news isn't pretty. That is, species like in grasslands have declined as a group by more than 75%. All these species have declined by over 75% since 1968. That means 3 out of 4 of these migratory birds are now gone off the planet. And we don't know why. In eastern forests, many of these species have declined as a group by over 32%, but many individual species have declined by 60%, 75%, 70%. In the case of wood thrush, cerulean warbler, golden-winged warbler, the declines are just striking. Migratory shorebirds as a group have declined by over 50% in the last 40 years, but some species like the red knot have declined by over 95%. A species that really just spends part of the year here on migration. In Texas, there are some individuals that overwinter in Louisiana, but there's a phenomenal red knot stopover that happens here in the Delaware Bay at the end of May, and it's thought that events there due to over-harvesting are probably driving the declines in red gnats, but it's probably a suite of various factors. And then there's a variety of common species that are declining at really alarming rates, but they're still fairly widespread, but they're declining at rates that are quite alarming. The point I'm trying to make is we've got a lot of species declining rapidly, and the problem is we don't know why. So even if we had the money and the resources to put into protecting them, we wouldn't know where to put the resources. And in part because we don't have information on migratory connectivity or full annual cycle biology. So we don't know what the threats are. Our gut is it's habitat destruction, and our gut might be it's in the tropics, but we just did a full analysis for wood thrush, and what we found was, I'm not going to go into these details, but what we found was there's actually a lot of deforestation that's happening in the southeastern U.S., combined with effects that are happening on the wintering grounds in places specific to Nicaragua and Honduras that are driving declines. But it's not just on the wintering grounds, but it's this combination of both things that might be driving the dynamics. So fundamentally, we just don't know where or why birds are dying. So I knew this was happening. I've been doing this and studying this for the past 25 years, believe it or not. And I decided to start a project called the Migratory Connectivity Project, which is really all about advancing the conservation and understanding of animals throughout their full life cycle by promoting the science of migratory connectivity. And some of our overall goals are basically to quantify the connectivity for birds in North America. And while that's our first goal, I don't want to stop there. I'm hoping we can get other people excited to do this for fish, for mammals, for a variety of groups, because it is so fundamental, and to do it in a systematic way. So we're doing it with species conservation concern first. But we also, in order to do this, we also have to improve and miniaturize tracking technology. Right now, the tracking tools are very expensive. The technology is not reliable. There are lots of issues there. And so a part of this big goal is to work with the various technology firms to try to improve this technology. And we're doing that, and we're making some pretty good headway there. And I want to make these more accessible, and part of that is reaching out to groups like the National Park Service, to managers and superintendents of these areas that wouldn't have access to this sort of information, and say, let's do some projects like we did with St. Croix this past couple of years. And let's make these things accessible to you. Let's try to find the funds to do it and come up with some projects that tell exciting stories, that create a virus of migratory connectivity, that get people more and more excited about what this does, that connects us in ways that we didn't imagine before, because we have these explicit connections that we share with these birds, these resources that are so important to us. Let's make that happen. But also by making the prices come down. That's another way to make this accessible that we're trying to make this happen. And ultimately, my hope is that we can take this information to stop the declines, to get this information to the people that are making the policy domestically and internationally to help curb some of these horrible things that are happening to our birds and other species. So I'm going to tell you just a few stories here, and then I thought we would just move into a discussion about how we can move this forward. But some of the projects that we're working on through the Migratory Connectivity Project is, the first thing is this large atlas that I'm writing called Discovering Unknown Migrations, the Atlas of Migratory Connectivity for the Birds of North America. Many of you probably are aware of the fact that for the past 100 years, the bird band, USGS's bird banding laboratory, has been putting aluminum bands and managing scientists that have been doing this all over the country, aluminum bands that uniquely identify birds. And then these birds are sometimes captured or shot or discovered dead elsewhere during the annual cycle. Well, over these 100 years or so, 6 to 7 million recoveries have occurred, and no one's really analyzed those recoveries to look at what those patterns of migratory connectivity are. Well, we've just completed that full analysis, and now we're putting together a book. And not just of the banding recapture data, but for every species where we have some information, we're also incorporating information from other tools, whether that's satellite telemetry or stable isotopes. So hopefully this will be out in the next couple of years, and it'll be our best compilation of knowledge of connectivity for birds that we have, and we'll build upon it, and it'll improve, I'm sure. So I'll show you a few examples of some of the species we've been working on. This is a black-polled warbler. It's a small warbler that weighs between 15 and 20 grams, breeds in boreal forests, and we've known they winter in South America for years. They've always been suspected of going on this like transatlantic flight right across the Atlantic Ocean, because they've shown up on in the middle of the Bahamas, or the Bermuda. They've shown up on ships, and they triple their weight in fat. So people have always assumed they go on a really long distance flight, but it's never been shown before. So what we did was we put something on these birds called a light level geolocator, which is a little backpack that we put on the backs of the birds, and it records the amount of light that they're exposed to and the time of day. And when you do that, you can actually figure out where you are on Earth with some error in terms of latitude and longitude. With latitude, your error is about 200 kilometers, and with longitude, it's about 150 kilometers. The problem is once you put it on the birds on their breeding grounds and you let them go, then you've got to recover them the following year. But we did that, and we were actually able to recover 5 of these black-polled warblers, and we got 5 data points filled with beautiful secrets that they've been holding back on us of where they've been going. And what we found was that in each of these cases, these birds left the North Atlantic and spent about 2 to 3 days migrating across the Atlantic down into the Dominican Republic in most cases, and then down into South America where they spent the winter, which is pretty revealing and confirmed what we thought about their transatlantic flights. So that was a light-level geolocator, and then just 2 years ago, colleagues of ours up at Low-Tech Wireless came up with something called a GPS geolocator. And so we were able to be the first to test these. And these GPS geolocators are 1 gram, and so we use them on a species called the ovenbird, which weighs about 20 grams. And we did this in Maryland and then up in New Hampshire. We put 25 of these out in each location. And the reason these are an advance is because they actually don't use light levels, but they actually turn on and get GPS satellite fixes and then turn off again once they have those fixes. And so they take 10 of these, and they give us we can program when they do that, and they give us exact locations, pinpoint locations to 10-meter level resolution of where these birds spent the winter. And so we put these birds on, on birds in Maryland and New Hampshire, and then you still have to recover them the following year. They don't transmit the information up to a satellite, but they still hold on to the information. And what we found was that the birds in Maryland, compared to the birds in New Hampshire, had completely non-overlapping winter distributions. On the left-hand side, you can see the birds in Maryland, the ovenbirds in Maryland, 4 of them spent the winter in Florida, and the other 6 spent the winter in western Cuba. And down here you can see, this is 50 meters. You can see the individual points that we got estimates for this one ovenbird over the winter. You can see it was in forest habitat. The birds from New Hampshire, most of them went to the Dominican Republic. 1 was in eastern Cuba. We've gotten several more back from New Hampshire, and they all went to the Dominican Republic. So completely non-overlapping winter ranges. And this technology now lets us look at the exact forest habitats that these birds have gone into. As you can see, it's almost non-overlapping. So this technology, we did this, I guess, 2 or 3 years ago. Then we started to, thanks to the help of John Putnam and folks, he put me in touch with folks up at the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway, Superintendent Chris Stein, who's on the call, as well as Jonathan Moore, and we worked with one of my graduate students, Callie Stanley, and this was sort of part of a larger group of sites that we put out these GPS geolocators on wood thrush, a different species, but also a species that's declining. And the main goal was to determine where these birds were wintering. And we got a variety of volunteers and local folks from up in Minnesota. It definitely was a large collaborative project, and we couldn't have done it without the help of lots of people. And we actually got, I think, 3 or 4 birds back where we got really incredible tracks of where these birds went from this national park. Here's a bird that actually spent the winter in Honduras. Another bird went to Nicaragua. And here's sort of a compilation of all these tracks. One of these birds actually went to Veracruz and spent the winter in a coffee farm, which is quite interesting. We can actually use these lat longs and zoom in and actually see, the exact land use habitat, the exact habitat these birds are spending the winter in. But look at how this sort of expands and sort of scales up the view of Chris Stein's National Park in terms of the resources that he shares with so many interesting areas in Central America. It provides a whole new perspective on how you manage your resources. And this is just one species. Some other examples, red knot, as I mentioned, a species that's declined by over 95% on the Atlantic seaboard. We put these other types of tags. These are actually GPS Argos tags, so they store 30 points, and then at one point at the end of a certain designated period, they transmit all the points up to a satellite. So you're not getting it all the way, as you'll see in another example. But this device weighs 3 grams, so it's the smallest device available. And then it transmits. So we put them on a red knot or 2 in Texas and another one in Delaware. And what we found was that this red knot actually bred way up here in Nunavut. And this bird, we think something happened. It must have failed as a breeder and then came back down here, and we got the point in on this island here in July. So we think it was actually a failed breeder. So this is still not exactly where we want it to be, but we're continuing to work with the companies to test these various technologies. Some other examples, we do a lot of satellite telemetry as well, where we have devices on species like black-bellied plovers. This is a 5-gram satellite tag that we deployed up in the North Slope of Alaska. We put them on 10 different birds here. And you can see as you track these journeys, there's wonderful stories and amazing information that's told along the way as these birds continue down to their wintering grounds. And this was a snapshot that I took, I think, probably 2 months ago. Several of these birds, this bird here in Peru is now still there. Several of these other birds have continued south. But again, it expands the scale at which you need to be thinking about these birds and how they're impacted by various things throughout their annual cycle. Another example, broadwing hawks that we banded up in boreal forest way up in the tar sands in Canada. Again, this was a shot I took maybe a month or two ago. These birds have continued south into South America. So those are just a few examples of how I think understanding migratory connectivity is really essential for understanding the biology and doing conservation with these species, but also telling really important biological stories to get more and more people engaged about the animals that are here in temperate areas or in places like our national parks. And so how do we take this and how do we improve management and conservation of migratory species? Well, I think one way is actually scaling up from national parks. Using this example of the one that Chris Stein and I used with the wood thrush and made these connections with wood thrush down to these other areas. But what's the next step there? How else can we then tell the story? We got wonderful press, and hopefully Chris will chime in a little bit and talk more about how that worked from his perspective. But we got wonderful press. But my hope is to take that to the next level and then to sort of do exchanges with resource managers, with park managers from places like St. Croix, or maybe it's Olympic, or maybe it's Rock Creek, or whatever the national park might be, with people on the ground where once we know where these birds are going. And then we can start really developing full annual cycle management plans to better protect these species, to better understand the threats that they're under. One of the first steps is really to sort of choose a species. We chose the wood thrush, but it was a perfect one for starting to make these explicit linkages, and then to use that as a model to move forward to make the linkages not just with the birds, but then hopefully with the people, because it's those linkages between the people and the governments and the NGOs that will really be able to ultimately do the management and the protection that we need to happen. So I'm hoping I convinced you all that ultimately to manage and to protect species, we have to move toward a full life cycle approach to our biology, our conservation, our outreach, and our policy. We have to advance miniaturization. That's going to be one of the key ways to do that. But we have enough now to start doing this. That's key. We definitely have enough now to start making some of these connections so we can start doing some things on the ground. This is the only way we're really going to be able to know which habitats to protect. There's just too much area out there. Yeah, we can protect the real gems, the gold mines. We can do that. But if we want to save species, we're going to have to really do strategic land protection, and we don't know where those areas are. But we also have to remove threats and do other types of wildlife management throughout the annual cycle if we want to ultimately save these species. The last thing I want to mention is that this is all coming together in many ways at this big conference that I'm hosting here in Washington, D.C. The National Park Service is one of the sponsors of this event. It's the North American Ornithology Conference. It's going to be August 16th and 20th. And the theme that I've chosen is something that's near and dear to my heart, which is basically bringing science and conservation together, which I think is really is going to be key to our success moving forward. It's not just going to be this conservation, and it's not going to be science. It's going to be bringing the two together and informing our decisions moving forward. And that's sort of what I think a lot of this migratory connectivity is at its essence. So I'll stop there and love to take some questions.
Peter, this is Chris Stein. I just wanted to congratulate you on a great presentation.
Thank you.
And I want to also recognize Jonathan Putnam for getting us interested here at the St. Croix in your migratory connectivity project to begin with. When I was looking for a sister park around the world who might want to partner with us on some issue like Great Rivers or other, John Putnam said to me, "Have you thought about your neotropical migratory birds?" And I said, "No, I haven't thought about my neotropical migratory birds, but that's a great idea." And then he put me in touch with you, and then the rest is history. And we've thoroughly enjoyed working with you these past couple of years. The maps that you showed, those we did get great press, as you mentioned. It captured the imagination of the people who live here in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area. Lots of questions, and this was just basic information. The fact that some of our birds migrate, not to mention all the other things you could learn from this and the tracking of these birds, but this was just a simple, people didn't have the understanding that where these birds go to at all. I've actually been down in Costa Rica a couple times, and when I ask people down there about their birds, that they notice that there's a time of year when the birds are no longer here, they say yes, but they also have no idea where the birds go to. So there's a need for education on both ends. But I would highly recommend to my National Park Service colleagues and others on the phone, if there's an opportunity to partner with you, Dr. Mara, that they do so.
Great. And, I'll just add that, while I would love to partner with as many national parks as possible, it doesn't have to be me, and I'm happy to sort of link folks up with other more local people, scientists that have the capabilities to track birds. I'm most interested in seeing this done. Not necessarily, I'm happy to help do it and facilitate it, but it doesn't have to be me at all. I'm really eager to make sure we're getting the data and getting people more and more excited about this approach to science.
Well, Pete, this is John Putnam. Just a question about the Migratory Connectivity Project. Obviously, the focus is on birds, but are you looking at other types of wildlife as well, whether they be sea turtles, whales, dragonflies, etc.?
Yeah, and so, we only have so much time and money, and that's really the limiting factor. We've had other people show some interest in these different areas, but not necessarily take the baton and run. We are doing research on dragonflies. In fact, we have a paper we're working on where we actually have demonstrated for the first time the full life cycle through multiple generations of a migratory dragonfly, so-called migratory dragonfly. And we've done other things with dragonflies. But we really need other people that really have a strong interest in sort of taking the baton for mammals or taking the baton for fish and moving this forward. It's such a lot of work, enormous amounts of work for doing this with birds. But the vision here is really to do this for all animals.
Dr. Mara, this is Marcia Keener. Do you have a challenge to either engineers or companies to get the miniaturization with the proper conditions and specs? Is there a possibility of having a partner offer such a reward?
Yeah, so we started something called the 1 gram challenge. It turns out that a 1 gram device that communicates directly with satellites or cell phones or whatever it happens to be that doesn't need recovery, that's inexpensive. We've developed the entire specifications for this device, and sort of we've created this thing called the 1 gram challenge, and we put it out there. And we're actually thinking about developing sort of a prize for that. But most of the developers are aware of the need for the miniaturization. The challenge is that these developers are on the edge already. They're small businesses that don't have a lot of resources to put towards engineering time. And anytime you go from a 5 gram to a 4 gram to a 3 gram device, believe it or not, it costs millions of dollars of engineering development time. And then those costs have to be recovered, and they're recovered by the expensive costs of these devices, which are often, for satellite devices, they're often $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. So we've been working with a lot of different groups, including groups like Airbus, Lockheed Martin, where they've got a lot of engineers on time and they have the potential for doing philanthropy to try to help with this problem. So we're working on it, and we're working with a lot of different people to try to advance this issue. But it's happening much more slowly than I'd like, but it's still happening faster than it would have had we not really started to push on this.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Pete.
And there's other people doing this too. Hey, Jim. How are you?
Hey, Pete. Hey, so the Park Service inventory and monitoring program, a lot of parks are implementing monitoring across the country, and that's a good way to tap into science in the Park Service. A lot of the networks are monitoring birds, and one of our greatest challenges is how do we translate the results that we're seeing in the monitoring to park managers and decisions that they're making on the ground. And we do know that a lot of the trends that we're seeing may be influenced by what's happening in the parks, but most of the time are, especially with migratory birds, are influenced by what's happening, in their overwintering sites. So this is a really great project. I love what you guys are doing. And certainly from the inventory and monitoring side, I think there's definitely an audience to tap into, or a way for you guys to, or your collaborators to be involved with multiple parks. So we can touch base offline if you want to, expand your contacts and know who's doing what where.
Yeah, Jim, just tell me where and when. I'm happy to do whatever you need me to do. I'd love to reach out to that group. I think there's definitely sort of a recipe to use those monitoring data to help prioritize and target species in specific parks, to try to understand, what the drivers are of those population dynamics. I wish I could say we were much further along in understanding population dynamics than we are. It's just amazing how little we actually know about how to do this. But this is the first step. This is really the first step, and the monitoring data are really, a critical piece to all of this. So yeah. Email me.
Great. So
let's do it.
I'll email you. One of the things I realized is you're recording this webinar, and it would be good to get a link to the recording, and I can spread that out to the rest of the science community and the Park Service.
Yeah. Great.
Yes,
thanks, Pete.
And this webinar is being recorded, so at some point soon we'll have all the webinars sent back out for everyone's access.
Yeah.
This is Angie Tornes. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay. I'm with the Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program, and we are located nationally in various offices, field offices and regional offices, working with communities on their conservation recreation goals. We work a lot with land trusts and other large land holders, personally with a lot of corporate land owners, like energy companies. I just wonder if this message of connection, importance of locally managed, I'm using that locally with quotes, managed properties are also key to the connection. And the parks units themselves are great too, but there's a lot more land out there. So I'm wondering if they are participating in your conference or being brought into the discussion somehow.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, just a little aside, there was a paper that came out in Science last week about how 91% of the migratory birds around the globe aren't on protected areas throughout their annual cycle. And I while I want to agree with the message, I kind of disagree with it, because I think it's hard to really assess how much private land is actually used and is made available to migratory birds, and does provide really important protection to them, because I think it really does. So it's a really tricky thing, and it's something we don't have a handle on. So, but to answer your question, I don't know how to reach out to that group. And I really would love to reach out to that group and bring them into this conference, because I think it is such an incredibly important group to reach. Because I think, when you look at collectively how much land they control, so I do a lot of work in urban areas where I'm dealing with, in residential areas where I'm dealing with 200, 300 residential landowners, and I'm trying to get them to change their land use practices as opposed to sort of one large land area. But I do that because it's such an important component of the landscape.
Well, I can share with you some ideas now or later, and I don't know how to get hold of you unless is Jonathan Putnam, International Affairs with the Park Service, so I can just find him on our...
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I'd be glad to connect you two.
Okay, thank you. I'll
Yeah,
just
private areas, private land management is essential. I love it.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks for your comment.
If we don't have any more phone questions, I did get one via the website. I don't know if you saw that, Pete, but it was Scott Gendy. The question is, how do you scale up to infer an area is relatively important compared to other areas? Conservation is triage, based on such small sample sizes. Stopover sites tend to be spatially aggregated, and so protection or conservation measures may work there. But you have a few points spread across very large areas. With fixed funds, how do you know to put your efforts to conserve habitats in southeast Florida versus the DR, for example?
Scott nailed it. I completely agree, and this is one of the big issues. And one of the things we're trying to figure out, we have a paper we've been modeling this idea, is that, how many samples do you really need? How many birds do you really need to track to figure out how strong the connectivity is? Is it 6? Is it 10? Is it 100? How much do these birds continue to spread out, to really understand sort of what is the area of inference that we need to understand to really grapple with the ovenbirds of Rock Creek National Park? What is the wintering area of the ovenbirds? I don't know the answer to that, because we really are on the leading edge of where this is all going. And we don't understand what drives connectivity, what causes connectivity. This is all new stuff. But I couldn't agree more that we need to grapple with those sorts of questions before we can really understand, how to then manage things on the ground. But it still is surprising that, with those points in Cuba, with the birds from Maryland, after 6 points, six tracks, actually the area that they encompass stopped changing. So with such a small sample size, this is from Jug Bay Wetland Nature Sanctuary over here in eastern Maryland. Six ovenbirds told us a lot about the general area where these birds were wintering. But those are the sorts of questions that we need to start grappling with. We just haven't had this sort of perspective on species before to start thinking about these next level of questions. So it's really a new area.
Thank you. So I had just one, I think maybe a final question for you, Pete. I'm just curious, do you know of any, is there sort of a one-stop shop, a clearinghouse for the multiple efforts that are looking at some of these is it the Migratory Connectivity Project? Is that a good place to find out all the different efforts, or has someone thought about doing something along those lines? So if I want to go tracking sea turtles, or who's tracking blue whales, the way to do that?
So that is one of our goals, to basically have all the live tracks available on our website, so people can actually see what the various species are. But there are a couple different websites you can go to get more information on different species. One is seaturtle.net, and the other is movebank.org, I think. But those are two places where they're database storage locations. But you can sort of see the list there. But one of my goals is for the Migratory Connectivity Project to be that one-stop shop, that clearinghouse of all the tracks out there for all animals. So whether you're an elementary school class that wants to do some sort of cool exercise with bird tracks or sea turtle tracks or whale tracks, you can go to our site and actually see it all there.
That's fantastic.
Are those linkages on your site?
Some of them are. So if you go to the Migratory Connectivity Project, right on the home page of the Migratory, you can just Google Migratory Connectivity Project. You'll see on the main page live tracks, and there are at least 6 different species there that you can actually see. But I just got money from a donor to develop a whole curriculum around tracking, and so my hope is that we're going to actually, and that same person is going to be starting to develop this clearinghouse for that website for a variety of species, and then also use it to develop some standardized curriculum for schools.
Great.
Well, I think that does it. I want to thank you so much, Pete. It was a great presentation, and I'm happy to connect anyone on this call with Pete if I could facilitate that. Again, he's been a great partner to the Park Service. I'd like to expand that further.
John, thanks so much. I really appreciate your support.
Yeah, hey, Pete, real quick, Pete, this is Dave.
Sure.
When John from the INM network contacts you, I'd like to be on those conversations too.
Yeah, of course.
And
Dave, where are you?
I'm with the Elaine Leslie. I've talked to you before about the thing you guys are having right before our
the Congress.
Yeah,
Ecological Congress.
The Congress. So Peter, we've talked on the phone about that before.
Great.
But
Super.
I'm in Fort Collins.
Yeah, I'll be glad to connect you two too if that helps, Dave.
No, I'll send him another email. I didn't know Jim's last name or John's.
It was Jim Comiskey.
Okay, I didn't catch the last name.
Yeah. All right.
Cool.
Thanks, Ben.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a great holiday.
Thanks for
Take care.
persevering.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.